Welcome to today's Planning Committee meeting. I'm Councillor John Ward and will be chairing the Planning Committee meeting today. On the top table are officers Sarah Everard and Tracy Lincoln, and my Vice Chairman on the left, Councillor Karen Vincent, and Committee Officer Dawn Matthews. Sadly, since we last met, one of our members, Councillor Sue Prutton, has died. So I'm going to ask you all to please stand for 1 minute's silence. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll now ask the Vice Chairman to read the fire safety notice.
Thank you, Chairman, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are not expecting a fire drill today, so if the fire alarm sounds, we'll need to evacuate the building. There are 2 fire exits from this room. One is through the double doors where you came in, and the other door is to the side of the stage, which leads to an external fire escape. Please note that you should not use a lift in the event of a fire, and in the event of an evacuation, we meet to the left of the driveway at the main entrance of Thorpe Lodge. Thank you.
Thank you. This meeting is being live streamed. Members of the public are welcome to film proceedings as long as they are not disruptive to the conduct of the meeting. If anyone wishes to film or record the meeting, will you please identify yourselves? Please can you all ensure your mobile phones and electronic devices are turned to silent. Councillors, please do not use your mobile phone whilst the committee is in session. We will have comfort breaks at various times throughout the meeting. If you must use your mobile, then please leave the room. However, you will appreciate that this could result in you not being able to vote on the matter under discussion at the time you leave the room. The order of business is as set out in the agenda. Members of the public can only speak if prior arrangements have been made, in accordance with the Council's scheme of public speaking. The time allocated is a maximum of 5 minutes per speaker. Only people who have registered to speak will be able to address the committee. The order will be as follows. The planning officer will present the application. Public speakers will then be asked to present their case, followed by questions from members of the committee to clarify something the speaker has said and not to invite the speaker to put further points across. Council members who are not members of this committee will then be invited to speak for the allocated time of a maximum of 5 minutes per speaker. The committee will then discuss and determine the application. Finally, there is no provision for members of the public to circulate documents, photographs, etc. at the meeting. Are there any questions before I open the meeting, please? Thank you. Well, we'll go to the agenda. Declarations of interest from anybody, please. None. Thank you. Apologies for absence, Dawn, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I've received apologies from Councillors Beadle, Karimi Guvenlu and Riley, and Councillor Holland is substituting for Councillor Riley.
Thank you very much. Right. You've all seen the minutes of the meeting held on the 30th of November. Those that were present, do you have any comments? Yes. All agreed on that? Thank you very much. Are there any matters arising from the minutes, please? No? Thank you. We go on to the applications. The first application, 2022-0739, the former David Rice Hospital site in Drayton. I'll ask Officer Sarah Everard to present that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. So this is an application to vary the Section 106 agreement at the former David Rice Hospital site. The site was originally granted outline planning permission in 2018, with the reserve matters consent being granted for this site last year. The Section 106 for this site is less than 5 years old, and as such, the agreement can only be varied by agreement of the council. So this planning permission was for 29 houses, of which 10 would be affordable. The development was going to provide the equivalent of 35% affordable housing, which was slightly over the Joint Core Strategy requirement at Policy 4, which is for 33%. As part of this proposal to vary the Section 106 agreement, the proposal is to remove all affordable housing from the scheme as it is no longer considered to be viable. So the site itself, as we said, it's the site of the former David Rice Hospital, which has now been demolished. This is the site in question in this area here. It's accessed from High Road in Drayton. Obviously, the site's location is outside of the development boundary, and it's between sort of Drayton and Helston settlements. Obviously, it is part of Drayton Parish. So this is the reserved matters layout from the scheme, which has been approved. As part of this application, we are not looking at any changes to this layout or the design of the dwellings, but I think it's just helpful just to show you the design and layout of the scheme. So we've got obviously the access coming in from the High Road. We've got this part of the site, which is closer to the High Road, where we've got the affordable housing, which we've got a group of 4 affordable houses. I don't know if you can just see my cursor in this area here, and a further group of 6 affordable units on this site here, and they're semi-detached units, and they're proposed to change to market housing as part of this proposal. We've got a further 7 market housing within this part of the site, and then to the south of the site we have got a larger area of 12 houses, which are larger properties with views over. So this site leads down towards the River Wensum Valley, so it provides views over the River Valley here. For these 12 larger properties, I will just show you some designs for some of those properties. They do include a cantilevered design, slightly differently from some of the other properties on the site. So these are some of the designs that have been approved as part of the reserve matters. And like I said, we're not reviewing the designs as part of this scheme. So for the 12 larger properties, this property here in the sort of the right-hand corner is indicative of what the properties are proposed to look like on the site. There are variations between the individual designs for those dwellings, but indicatively, obviously, it shows that cantilevered approach and quite a contemporary modern design. The other market houses on the site are, again, indicatively as an example shown here. And then the current affordable houses on the scheme is on the left-hand side. And they have been designed to reflect those similar to the market housing in that more northern section of the site. So in terms of this scheme, a viability appraisal has been submitted by the applicants, which has set out that the scheme is not viable to provide any affordable housing. We have looked at this independently with a company called CP Viability, who have carried out a viability appraisal for the council. The viability appraisal is undertaken following the guidance through the planning practice guidance, which is the national guidance that we must use to assess viability on schemes. That guidance looks at the total sales value for the scheme and then looks at a range of inputs and costs for a scheme to work out then whether or not it can achieve a benchmark land value. So inputs into the scheme and costs include things such as the construction costs, development finance, marketing, sales costs, professional fees, and also developer return. Within a viability appraisal, a developer return is included. The guidance tells us that this should be between 15 and 20% to make a developer scheme, and that is written within the national guidance. In terms of sales values, our viability appraisal has looked at comparable schemes in the area. There aren't exact comparables to this development and design, and I think that is important to note, but we have looked at properties within the immediate vicinity around sort of within Drayton and sort of close to the site, looking at larger properties, particularly for these sort of ones to the south of the site, larger developments, larger schemes with larger floor areas and a more contemporary higher end spec to look at those as comparables. The key element in terms of the viability appraisal is the build costs for the site. The build costs on this scheme are higher than what would normally be expected on a scheme of 29 houses. This is particularly due or predominantly due to the design of the dwellings on the site, including that cantilever design. We haven't just taken the applicant's word in terms of the build costs on this site. Following advice from CP Viability, we have gone out and got a further quantity surveyor to do an order of cost estimate for this scheme to look at what the build costs for this scheme would be. And we have then used those build costs to inform our own viability appraisal that's been undertaken independently for the council. What that has basically shown us is that when we include the build cost, even if we reduce that developer return down to the lowest level set out within the planning practice guidance, down to the 15% level, this scheme isn't showing as being viable with any affordable housing on the site. As part of this, we did consider the design of the dwellings. Obviously, we have supported the design as part of the reserve matter, so we didn't feel we could request that the design of the dwellings could be amended at this stage. So based on the viability information, we are, which has all been independently assessed, we are recommending that the deed of variation is allowed to remove the affordable housing on the scheme. We would, however, require a clawback condition in this scheme so that if the sales values were higher than expected, a contribution towards affordable housing would be required. Other things just to note is as this would change the scheme from having affordable dwellings to having market dwellings, there would be a slightly higher SIL charge the applicant would be expected to pay, because affordable dwellings do not pay SIL, whereas market dwellings obviously do. So they would be expected to pay that SIL charge for those additional 10 dwellings as well, just for information. And I think the other thing we'd want to do is if they were obviously to come in and change the design at any time that may make a scheme more viable, we would also look at requiring the viability to be reappraised as part of that process. So therefore, at this stage, we are recommending that it is for approval and that deed of variation, to allow that deed of variation to occur. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillors, do you have any questions for the officer, please? Yes, Councillor Folger.
Thank you, Chairman. As you alluded to, there was originally a provision here for 10 affordable units to be part of this application. Obviously, costs have gone up, but we've had an extremely protracted procedure at the moment to complete these viability checks, and I think you alluded to the fact that if the sale price of some of these properties, there could be some provision for this, because within the parish there is quite a lot of disappointment as far as this is concerned, and to go from 10 to no affordables is quite a large step, and the public at large and opinion of the parish council was that they would obviously accept that there would be a reduction in the numbers, and I think they were looking at some in the area 4 or 5 units, which would be acceptable, and there is keen disappointment as far as this is concerned. So obviously the proposal is that there would be no affordables at the moment, but would you think that there would be a possibility that in view of the possible higher sale prices of properties on there, that there could be some inclusion therein.
I think it's difficult to give a guarantee on that. I mean, and I do appreciate exactly where you're coming from and where the parish are coming from. I think dropping from 10 to 0 is a significant drop, and I do fully appreciate that concern. Obviously, we have gone out and had that independent viability assessment, and that has shown that at the moment the scheme isn't viable. It's like my put it, it's not actually, the scheme is not actually viable even without the affordable housing on this scheme. So if those sale prices are going to be particularly higher than to be expected, they can be. That's why we always include that clawback in that Section 106 agreement. And I think we wouldn't look at recommending it to you without some sort of provision to try to gain some of that contributions back if we are able to. But I can't make a guarantee that what would happen. I think that as long as we'll make sure that a clawback would be worded so that if it does increase, we could have something there.
Thank you. I've got Councillor Vincent, followed by Councillor Fisher, followed by Councillor Holland. So, Councillor Vincent.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Sarah, for your presentation. My question follows very similar to Councillor Folger in that it is extremely disappointing to see that we've lost all affordable housing units on this site, especially given the size of the properties being built and I would say the expected sales value of them. They're not small properties by any means. Is it fair to say that we find ourselves in a situation where we just don't have a comparable site to test the market values of those properties, and which would have an impact on that viability assessment?
I think we have, obviously, as you've suggested, those designs are unique. So obviously it's difficult to find comparables. Our consultant obviously is very experienced in that and has drawn comparables to where they've got those. And that's obviously why we've also gone out to get the costs assessed. So I think absolutely there's always a level of uncertainty in terms of what that will mean, and therefore what the actual costs are, and then what will be produced in terms of the sales values. So we've had to agree a base point to be able to fix the viability appraisal, but obviously that is setting that benchmark so that we are able to claw back anything should obviously the sales values outstrip what we've already set out in that base level.
Councillor Fisher.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a couple of, the way I understand what Sarah's just said is that effectively because of the design being a cantilever, that increases the build costs, and hence because the build costs are increased, we're now having to lose the affordable housing. If that's an interpretation, then surely the other option is to work with the developer on a cheaper build cost because of design, and hence return at least some affordable housing. I mean, is this a developer? Well, second question: is this a developer we've worked with before, and are they always of a style where they build, should I say, up end of the market, which I no problem with having some decent, unusual design, quality, large houses. But if by building those particular types of unit, we then lose total input from any affordable housing, then I question as to whether our policy of affordable housing at 30% is correct anyway, if someone can have a viability assessment and actually prove that 30% that we would like as part of a policy, should we not therefore change the policy to say we just negotiate affordable housing with every developer? If you answer them at the moment, I'll be happy.
I'll start, and then I might have to just pass over to Sarah. So in terms of Could a different design come forward? And absolutely, Councillor Fisher, that's something that we've explored. I guess we have granted a reserve matters, so we can't take that away. The reserve matters has been approved with that design, so that's obviously what it's been tested against. Could a different scheme come forward to be acceptable? Absolutely. The site is fairly sensitive. Obviously, it's in the River Valley, but it doesn't need this design to make it acceptable. Obviously, we've deemed this design to be acceptable through the grant of reserve matters. That doesn't mean that something else couldn't come forward. So I think that's the position, and that would be a legitimate position for the committee to take should you have concerns in terms of varying the legal agreement. Obviously, as we set out in the report, the variation of this legal agreement at this time is only by agreement of the council. So should we on any scheme we decide within the first 5 years of signing a section 106 that we don't find that acceptable because the obligation still serves a useful purpose, we decline to approve that. There's no decision notice, there's no right of appeal within the first 5 years. So the applicant would have to come back in with a further full application and obviously test that. I guess the difficulty we're in is that, you know, we're presented with a scheme that we've found acceptable through reserve matters, and we're presented with a viability which demonstrates unless this changes, then the scheme's not viable. Interesting on this one, it's still unviable at 0% affordable housing. So that's an interesting dilemma for the applicant in terms of actually whether the scheme is deliverable in any event. But that's what we're presented with, and which is obviously what we've assessed on that. Forgetting your other questions, have we dealt with this developer before? I'm going to just look to Sarah for that in terms of, obviously we're dealing with the landowner and promoter rather than necessarily a developer.
Yes, I think we have had. I think there are other. We have had other schemes, and again, I can't think about other schemes at the moment. Obviously, we've have got Gavin in the room here, but obviously, rather than an end developer, but we have had obviously dealt with on other schemes in the past.
Just also then so we're tied up because it's reserved matters, but where does the 106 agreement then fit statutorily if we're saying that we have to look at this because the reserved matters have been agreed on this design, presumably the 106 agreement was part of those reserved matters as well. So if we can change the 106 agreement on the affordable houses, we could go down the route of changing the 106 agreement on the design.
So the section 106 is approved at the point of the grant of the outline permission, which obviously establishes the level of affordable housing. So that's what the developer, the applicant, signs up to when they when they have a grant of planning permission. What the legislation says is that the council doesn't have to enter into a negotiation to vary that section 106 in the first 5 years. You know, legitimately, we should be able to expect someone signing up to a section 106 should be able to honour that. You know, that's a contract that is being entered into at the point of the grant of permission. In reality, practically, we know things change, build costs change, and the financial position changes, which is why we do entertain some of those proposals. Obviously, we need to be pragmatic, but we also need to ensure that we're protecting, you know, the delivery of affordable housing. So there's always a balance in these. Absolutely.
Councillor Holland.
Thank you. Yes, I think you may just have answered my question. I was going to, you said that it was acceptable to have a 15% profit or between 50 and 20% profit. My question was going to be, how much of a percentage profit will there be with no affordable housing? But I think you've just answered that by saying that there is virtually not viable anyway. Is that right?
So if this scheme, and how we tested it is, if this scheme achieves a 15% profit, which is the sort of lowest limit that the planning practice guidance tells us we should achieve, it doesn't achieve what's called the benchmark land value. So the benchmark land value is the value for the existing use value for the land, plus what's considered to be a reasonable return for a landowner on top of that. So it's not meant to be a huge additional return, but it's meant to be a reasonable return for that's going to make a landowner want to sell the land for it to be developed. So even with a 15%, it's not achieving the benchmark land value. If we achieve the benchmark land value, the developer's return drops significantly, and it doesn't really achieve a return. So that does that's how we've looked at it and how our viability assessor has looked at it.
Councillor Adams?
Yeah, just a quick question. If we are minded to say no, would the applicant have the right of appeal to a planning inspector?
No, because we are not obliged to enter into any agreement in the first 5 years of signing a Section 106. There's no decision notice that is issued. We advise that the obligation still serves a useful purpose, because clearly it does. It's an affordable housing obligation, and there's no right of appeal. Once that obligation, Section 106, has reached 5 years, then there's a formal application process. It's a formal Section 106A application that the applicant can submit, and that would then have a formal decision notice, which can then be appealed. Obviously, we're not that far off that 5-year period. So I think it's around July next year where that Section 106 would reach a 5-year period, in which case that could formally come through that means.
As I understand it, we've already lost one appeal to a planning inspector on something very similar. Am I correct?
Which one's that you're referring to me?
I think, as I say, it's nothing to do with this application, but it's just almost very similar. There was a similar one, I think, where they said they'd supplied 10. It went down to 2. We refused. It went to a planning inspector, and so I understand the planning inspector has upheld the appeal.
I'm not recalling that one off the top of my head, Councillor Adams, but I'm happy to go away and look at that.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Leggett?
Thank you, Chairman. My question has just been answered because I was uncertain about that point you made on appeal. So I see that would be ruled out because it isn't relevant, as you were saying. And Councillor Fisher raised the other point I had, Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Vincent?
Thank you. Mine was going to be about the 5-year and whether this would be eligible for appeal, but you've answered that question. Thank you. My other question, looking at some of the concerns raised by residents about the loss of trees and things like that, and a reference you'd made to that particular site, can I just ask, was the granting of affordable, as part of granting the permission in the first place, was the provision of affordable housing a material consideration at that point?
Yes, it was a material consideration.
I think it's probably, we need to be clear. Obviously, the application wasn't within the development boundary. The council didn't have a 5-year supply at the time, although that changed by the point of grant of permission. So obviously it was, were sufficient material considerations to outweigh the development plan. Clearly, the delivery of policy compliant or above policy compliant at the time was a fundamental material consideration within that.
Councillor Holland? Okay. Councillor Brennan?
Thank you, Chair. I find it very worrying that we approve applications on the basis of affordable housing being included, and time after time the developer comes back and says, I can't afford it. Well, they should make this decision at the start, not come back later and try and change their mind. But we need these affordable houses. And in my mind, it's just a developer being greedy and underhand by coming back and saying, oh no, I got that all wrong. Well, get it right in the first place, I think, is what we should be doing. And surely there must be some mechanism where we can ensure that the developer does deliver what they said they're going to deliver. If the price of the houses that they're trying to build doesn't make it viable, change the whole situation, come back with a new application where they can provide the affordable housing.
Any further questions for the officer?
I'll move, Chairman,
just-
that we do not accept the variation to Section 106 agreement. I so move.
Okay, can I just say something? This application first came in 2017. The developer didn't know there was going to be a war in Ukraine at that time. I've been involved with the castle redevelopment. The costs there have just gone through the roof on things like steel and glass. And, the developer's having to pick up all those costs now. That is the main point that's made this unaffordable. Okay. Now, yes. No. Was there a seconder for Councillor Adams?
second that.
No, you're not allowed to speak, sorry.
Sorry, Chairman, the gentleman seems to be suggesting he has sent an email in to
email confirmation that I was given 5 minutes to speak.
Do you know where that's come from, sir?
Have you got it on your phone? You can show it to us.
By Geraldine, planning consultants, who was in discussion with Sarah.
So not from the council. Mr. Chairman, it's at your discretion, Chairman, if you wish to allow.
Unless the gentleman can show us some proof of this email, I can't allow you to speak.
It seems to have come from someone outside rather than from the council.
I think Sarah liaised with the agent yesterday and confirmed that he hadn't registered to speak.
Sorry, say again.
I think Sarah spoke with the agent yesterday who confirmed he hadn't registered to speak.
So have you got something from the council then? Yeah, okay. No, I won't, not unless he's got some proof. We didn't give permission from here, but there was an email and we've seen the email. So if you'd like to come forward. If you could introduce yourself, and then when you're ready, you'll have 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and through you. I'm Gavin Elsey. I am one of the development team. I'm not planning to take up the full 5 minutes, but I am happy to answer any questions that people may have. And Sarah and Tracy have amply identified the reasons for us bringing this forward. I'll just give you a brief summary. Thank you to the members of the committee for allowing me the opportunity to speak. As many of you will know, the former David Rice Hospital site planning process has now entered its 5th year, one of the most protracted processes I have known, which is due in part to the public interest in the site and the need to be as kind and sympathetic to the site as possible. A consequence of this is that the style and type of dwelling that has had to be such a high specification, it has nearly doubled the associated construction cost for a residential dwelling. Without having submitted plans for properties of such a high level, the local interest in the site would have meant that the outline approval we got would have been refused. We were aware for the need for affordable social housing. We looked to value engineer where possible to facilitate provision, but it simply makes the whole scheme unviable. We have endured untold delays in the planning process, not helped by 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic and now the war in Ukraine, and now the nutrient neutrality issue. Through this process, there has been a dwindling pool of available building craftsmen and exponential rises in the cost of materials. Many of you may be aware, as has already been demonstrated, that when considering a building scheme, there is an expectation that a developer will realise a return on development of approximately 15 to 20%. In this case, we have waived this and we're prepared to accept the less than 5% return, which is only possible with the removal of the affordable housing quota. We've taken independent professional advice regarding the scheme viability, which was then verified by the council's own independent professional, whom we had to pay for, who confirmed our calculations. We're a diligent and compassionate developer, which is why we are building on approximately 10 acres of the 36-acre woodland site, the remainder being left open for all to enjoy, and we will continue to invest in the site for decades to come. We're forming a community interest company, a KIC, which will have a board made up of other key stakeholders and residents, whereby we will be injecting tens of thousands of pounds for the upkeep and improvement of the site. We're also aware that through this application that our SIL payments will increase, and we're happy with that. We're also happy with a clawback clause to demonstrate that we are trying our best to work with the local authority and that we are conscientious in the need to provide social housing. I'm aware that there are members who are unclear about our intended use, which is C3, which you can be absolutely assured is correct. We've invested heavily in ensuring we are compliant. This isn't relevant to this application and therefore should have no bearing, but outside of this committee and aside from this decision, I'm happy to discuss this with anyone. The planning process has been long and protracted, which has helped nobody, not us, residents or the authority, and has already cost us more than £1.5 million. In view of all of this, I would ask the committee to approve our application and allow us to move forward on this project for everyone's benefit. Happy to take questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. If any councillors have questions for the speaker, please? Yes, Councillor Fisher.
So I'm not sure whether I heard all of that correctly. The nitrate neutrality thing, is that impacting on your costs?
It is impacting on our cost because at some point we are going to have some kind of calculation whereby our costs are going to increase because we will have to have some kind of nutrient neutrality offset. The other thing that it's doing is it's delaying us from starting the process, which is costing me approximately £50,000 a month because I can't put a spade in the ground until the planning authority, along with the other authorities in South Norfolk, have come up with a scheme that Natural England are happy with.
Thank you. Yes.
Sorry, perhaps the officer can advise. I thought any application that had been determined prior to the letter of last March was okay to proceed.
So can you just repeat the question? Could have this been granted prior to March? Was that the question? Was the question about the timing of this decision prior to March?
About nutrient neutrality.
Yeah, I thought that any decision that had been made prior to the letter from Natural England in March was okay to go ahead.
I'm just going to pass to Sarah because who can explain in terms of whether or not, obviously, it's caught by nutrient neutrality. In principle, things that have an outline and a reserve matters granted are acceptable, but it's then subject to whether or not there are conditions that go to the heart of the permission, and therefore we can discharge the conditions because conditions are also caught. But I'm just going to pass to Sarah in terms of the specifics.
Yes, so I think as Tracy sort of said on this one, so we do have a condition and we do still need on this site further flood risk information. The condition is worded such that it's prior to the commencement of development that flood risk information needs to be submitted and agreed. So conditions do get caught. So obviously they can't commence until that information has been submitted and agreed. And
I think I'm just going to have to. I don't think that decision has been absolutely made in terms of whether this site is caught. We have to look at all of those conditions and decide on a balance in terms of the content of the condition and the nature of the condition and the wording of the condition, whether that means it goes to the heart. And by the going to the heart of the permission, I mean you cannot commence development. So there are no works that you can do on the site without these details. So there's a slight nuance between that and a prior to commencement condition. But obviously we have to look at all of those conditions and whether or not the decision can be implemented or not. And I think there are a number of conditions that we clearly still need to work through. My understanding from Sarah is that the viability hasn't included the nutrient neutrality. However, it's still clearly uncertain as to whether that would be an additional cost or not.
Councillor Vincent.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm a bit confused because got a similar question to Councillor Fisher, and I was looking at paragraph 5.12 of the report, which says the application does not propose the creation of additional overnight accommodation beyond that which was already permitted at outline stage, and it's basically suggesting there isn't a nutrient neutrality issue on this particular application.
And my apologies if there's clearly any confusion on that. So there are a number of conditions on the permission that we would need time to work through in terms of whether or not it's actually caught, and that's because of the wording of those particular conditions.
Any further questions for the
Yeah.
speaker? Yes.
So in fact, whatever we decide today, it's still going to be caught up with nitrate neutrality issue anyway.
Potentially, we need to work through the conditions in terms of whether they are caught, because obviously the outlines, so the reserve matters is granted, so that's established the principle. It's just whether or not any conditions are caught, and that's around the nature and wording of the conditions, which I don't think has clearly been gone through in any detail as yet.
Yes, I'll let you speak.
Chair, if I may, it may help. Part of our application is that we have to get what's called an S104 signed off, which is approval from Anglian Water for our services into site. And at this moment in time, Anglian Water won't sign off our S104 because they want confirmation that we've met any nutrient neutrality condition prior to them making a decision. So we're caught in the middle, and we've been told that the flood risk and drainage that we need to provide can't be signed off because of nutrient neutrality, which means that if we do any kind of building work at all, we do it at risk, and we run the risk of potentially having to completely redo any works that we've done if they decide that any material changes need to be made. So we're kind of betwixt and between, and at this moment in time can't stick a fork in the ground.
Any further questions for the speaker, please? No, Mr. Elsie, if you'd like to resume your seat over there, please. Right, over to you, councillors.
Well, in the light of what I've heard, Chairman, I will withdraw my original proposal because we're nearly into July anyway, and I don't think anything's going to get started before July, by which time the whole situation might have changed again with regard to land values, etc., etc. So I will change now that, in fact, that we do allow this application.
Okay, you're seconding it. Right, any further speakers before we go to the vote? Proposed and seconded that we go with officer's recommendation. All in favour?
1, 2, 3, 4, Chairman.
Against?
1, 2, 3, 4, Chairman.
Right, it's my decision, so we will go with the officer's recommendation. Thank you. Okay. We'll just take a 5-minute break while the officers change over, and then we'll go to the next application. Meeting resumed, thank you. The next application, 2022-1684, the former Lingwood First School, and Richard Smith is presenting.
Thank you, Chair. So this application is also made for a deed of variation to the Section 106 agreed under the original outline application, which was granted in October 2019. And that application is 2019-0278, and it also relates again to affordable housing provision. The proposal as presented here is to reduce the affordable housing provision from 28% to 9%, or otherwise simply as 6 units to 2 units on this site. This is a prospective development comprising 22 units in total. I'll just show you the location plan. So this is the location of the site. You can see the OS detail in terms of the former First School, set within the development limits of Lingwood, surrounded by residential estate housing. The original outline application, as approved in October 2019, was purely for residential development, including the demolition of the former infant school. Only access was approved at that point. This aerial slide shows the demolition of the school now, and obviously you can see the site access there in Off Chapel Road, and you can obviously see the surrounding context, very much typical estate housing, with characteristics mainly mixture of bungalows and semi-detached. Obligations existed in respect of affordable housing scheme and also of open space. And if there was any deficiency in the amount of open space within the site, then it was to provide an off-site contribution. Turning to the layout slide, that's been approved under the Reserve Matters. The Reserve Matters application 2020-1611 had full details of appearance, landscaping, layout and scale of development for the 22 units approved. And that was approved in February 2022. Don't know if any of you recall, this was presented to this committee in January this year. This committed 6 of the 22 dwellings as affordable housing units, 4 of which were to be for rent and 2 as shared ownership. This also provided some open space on site, cost $26,770, with the balance provided in an off-site contribution totaling nearly $40,000. Overall total of open space contribution was $66,110. There's a seal payment that's been calculated at $176,000. The application 1684 before us today, then, the current proposed application is submitted to vary the original Section 106 under the outline to allow for the reduction from 28 to 9%. And that includes a review mechanism within the Section 106. Under Joint Core Strategy Policy 4, it confirms the proportion of affordable housing sought may be reduced and the balance of 10 years amended where it can be demonstrated that site characteristics, including infrastructure provision, together with the requirement for affordable housing, would render the site unviable in prevailing market conditions, taking account of the availability of public subsidy to support affordable housing. The applicants have therefore submitted a viability appraisal, and the council have requested an independent review of its content and conclusions in the current prevailing market conditions. The headlines to note from this is that the full quota of the affordable housing at 28%, which would amount to 6 units, are considered to render delivery of the scheme unviable. However, the applicant has suggested that 2 units, i.e. the 9%, can be or are offered. As an update to the committee at paras 5.7 to 5.9, this would be based on a 10-year split to be agreed through the affordable housing scheme. This offers the applicant time to investigate if at least one of the units can be a rental unit, and that can be of any interest to a registered provider, which the housing officer considers would be potentially possible. Whatever the 10-year, units 14 and 15, as shown in the slide here, both of which are 3-bedroom, 5-person houses, have been put forward as the affordable housing units. The applicants consider this would provide a marginally viable scheme, and the independent assessment concurs with this overall conclusion. Turning to the actual viability assessment itself, a number of scenarios with different sales prices and different levels of affordable housing were proposed by the applicants. All showed negative land values. CP Viability, our independent viability consultants, chose to look more closely at the appraisal relating to the 2 affordable units, i.e. because that's been offered, and based on a higher gross development value model, i.e. higher sales prices. CP Viability have carried out their assessment in line with the National Planning Practice Guidance. They've looked at specific build costs for the project. They've confirmed that if providing the 2 affordable units, not the 6, as I've put in the report there, so that's an update on the report, this will be based on returning a negative land value of still at nearly £500,000, so that's 485,772, which is significantly below the benchmark land value of 177,263 on this scheme, which CP consider to be a relatively modest allowance when related to their experience in the wider region. So they considered the benchmark land value at 177,263 to be reasonable. CP then ran a calculation using the industry recognised Argus software based on the 2 rented rather than the 2 shared ownership units. And please note again, this is where the update is on the printed papers, as this was clarified as an error in the text of the report only late last week. I'll just move on to a comparison table here of some of the areas that CP Viability undertook their appraisal. And in reviewing the applicant's figures, CP took a different approach to the following. The applicant's build costs, the applicants had put in build costs at £172.52 per square foot. CP went for 150.45 based on RIC's guidance. Contingency at 3.85% for the applicants. CP asked for contingency of 3%. The developer return was coming in at 20.16, which obviously, as we've been talking about this morning, is at the higher end of the National Planning Practice Guidance threshold of 15 to 20%. CP scaled this down to 17.02%. The legals were costed at £1,878 per unit by the applicant. CP have costed themselves at £900 per unit. However, in terms of the finance, when the applicants had drawn up their viability appraisal in June 2022, this came out at 6%, but CP have actually raised that to 7%, and that's reflective of obviously the market conditions in the autumn in terms of the finance sector. In terms of sale prices, CP looked at existing values of sold properties in Lingwood, and they had no tangible evidence to justify a departure from the values used by Savills in their appraisal. It should be noted, in terms of the build costs, the council supported design of the dwellings as part of the Reserved Matters approval. These designs are considered to be of good quality and will relate well to the surrounding context, which is required in significance of the fact this is an infill brownfield site. Got some house types here which show the affordable housing plots, plots 14 to 15. And then this is a typical plot, which is house type 2, which is the most common other plot on the site. And as you can see, going between the 2 different house types, they are fairly consistent and they blend in quite well. Turning to the calculations, the market value of these units as a rental model, together with the remaining Section 106 requirement, i.e. the open space at 66,110, and also factoring the seal payment at 160,000, was calculated. This returned a residual value of 125,367. Based on these 2 affordable housing units being rented, this would still be below the benchmark land value of 177,263. Therefore, if offered as the 2 rental units, the viability becomes much more compromised, particularly in the current housing market, where some volatility is still being experienced. When the calculations have been rerun by CP based on the 2 shared ownership units, not the 2 rental units, the residual land value rises to 220,000, but crucially above the benchmark land value. Where based on 1 shared and 1 rented unit, this now equals 185,000, but again, just above the benchmark land value of 177,000. CP were in agreement with the applicant's conclusions that this was a marginally viable scheme with the offer of the 2 affordable units. But their feedback suggests that in meeting and surpassing the benchmark land value of 177,000, these could potentially be 1 shared, 1 rental, or 2 shared ownership units. The applicant has confirmed that they're happy to investigate that either 10-year split, and the housing officers are content to work with them on that basis. CP have confirmed that the viability pressure on the scheme has increased since Section 106 was signed in October 2019. And obviously, I go back to the reserve matters, which was approved in February 2022, and obviously much before the time where build costs have spiraled. Even with their adjusted figures of build costs, contingency, developer return, legals, finance, CP ultimately came to the exact same conclusion, that with the 2 affordable units, the open space and the seal payment, the scheme would still be marginally viable. So notwithstanding the above, CP have recommended a typical clawback mechanism within the Section 106 which would be included. This would allow for a re-examination of the scheme should market conditions improve and the scheme become more viable than expected. It is, however, noted that with the reserve matters approval, the development needs to be begun before February 24, which is little more than 12 months left. Importantly, it would provide 22 units on a brownfield site and deliverable. Therefore, the recommendation, Chair, remains to approve the variation of the current application for the Section 106 to allow for the reduction of the affordable housing from 28% to 9% and a review mechanism within the Section 106. This is offered as 2 units with the exact 10-year mix, whether shared ownership or 1 shared and 1 rented, to be investigated and agreed as part of the affordable housing scheme under the Section 106 obligations, and the variation will be based on this. This will allow the developer time to further investigate, indeed, if 1 rental unit could be of any interest to a registered provider and could be provided. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillors, do you have any questions for the officer, please? Councillor Vincent.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Richard, for your presentation. I guess I'm a little confused by all these numbers that have been quoted, the 177,000 and so on. I was just looking at the supplementary papers that came out, and if we were looking at 1 shared ownership and 1 rented, or 2 shared ownership, they're both above that tipping point. Was there any consideration whether 3 shared ownership? At what point have we tested it to get as close as possible to that tipping point? Thank you.
Well, ultimately, CP have done the testing and based on the 2 affordable housing units, because that's ultimately what was offered by the applicant. I think their conclusion was obviously it was marginally viable as it was with the 2. And I think essentially, obviously, the percentage in terms of the value of the properties decreases obviously every affordable unit that you obviously add into the scheme. I think when we looked at all these different scenarios, and certainly there was a number of different scenarios tested by both Savills and a further set of quantity surveyors, and they looked at those different scenarios, and there was one with 5 affordable units provided, but ultimately that was actually generating a significantly negative land value. One model was predicting it was over £1 million in the red. So essentially, I think the conclusion was from CP that the 2 units was a fair offer. So they haven't obviously tested sort of variations of that, whether 3 or what have you. But one thing I did ask them to do is just look a bit more closely at whether having 1 shared and 1 rented could still be viable. And their conclusion was, whilst it gets quite tight, it is potentially possible. So that's what we based our assessment on.
Okay. Any further questions, please? Yes, Councillor Holland.
What exactly do you think the chances are of 1 rented being accepted by anybody, like a housing provider or whoever might want to rent it out? I mean, 1 on its own is not really particularly useful, is it?
Yeah, well, certainly in my experience, I mean, albeit I've come from Leeds, where I worked for a number of years, that this was very unusual for an RP to take on 1 single unit within an estate, with all the management issues and the servicing that goes with that. Having said that, I did speak to the housing officer, and they said that they are aware of 1 particular registered provider that would potentially be interested in this, and they are actively looking. So when that was put to the applicant, they were happy to look into that and explore that. I still remain of the view that you have to look at either scenario, because ultimately there will be a limited number of RPs out there that potentially will take on 1 unit in a location like Lingwood, but I'm happy to look into it. And in fact, the affordable housing obligation in the Section 106 allows a scheme to be obviously put forward, and then we can still investigate that as part of that. So I'm happy to look into it.
Any further questions for the officer? No, thank you. Then
I'll
Mis-
move the officer's
No,
recommendation.
just a minute. You're too soon, Tony. Sorry, Mr. Hill, like to come forward, please. Okay, if you'd like to both introduce yourself. You have 5 minutes, Mr. Hill, then from when you start.
Good morning. I'm Ian Hill from Bidwells and joined by Jason Wood from Torrington Properties.
Hello.
We represent Repton Homes and Torrington Properties, and thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning. I think your officers provided a very comprehensive report, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. I'll try and keep this very short. Torrington Properties have sought to implement the planning permission and adhere to the requirements of the Section 106 agreement. However, as we've heard, since the COVID-19 pandemic, Torrington Properties have, like most of the construction industry, experienced large increases in costs and general difficulties in obtaining materials. It was not until quotes for the construction work were obtained from contractors via tender returns and a detailed cost plan produced that concerns regarding the development's viability and deliverability were identified. As we've heard, my client instructed Savills to undertake a number of development appraisals to understand the viability of the development. These appraisals, which have been independently reviewed by the council's valuer, have demonstrated it is necessary to revise the provision of affordable housing to ensure that the scheme is viable. Again, as we've heard, on the chance that the viability of the scheme does improve, a clawback mechanism is going to be included to ensure that any surplus profit generated will be returned to the council to help facilitate affordable housing. The reduction of affordable dwellings due to unprecedented rises in labour and material costs is unfortunate, but it would ensure that the development of this vacant site can go ahead at the earliest available opportunity. And indeed, my client's intention is, subject to obviously the approved recommendation going through today, to start on site as soon as possible. In light of this, we hope you feel able to endorse the recommendation of your officer and support this proposal. As I say, Jason and myself here are able to answer any questions you may have, but don't have anything else to say, so thank you for your time.
Thank you. Councillors, do you have any questions, please? Yes, Councillor Brennan, then Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. You've just said that you're ready to get going as soon as possible if we vary the 106. Might I ask why you didn't put spades in the ground as soon as you got the planning permission originally, when it was viable? Why have you waited till now to then come to us and say it's no longer viable? Would it have been viable back then? And therefore, why did you not start when you got the planning permission?
No. Has never been viable based upon the 6 units. So we're between the time when we received our reserve matters approval, we then procured the project, got tenders back, and during that period, we've been working really hard to VE the scheme to try and make it viable. So rather than kind of just sitting there doing nothing, we've tried to be proactive in terms of looking at how we could reinvent the scheme, change it without changing the planning position to try and make it affordable. So this really is our last position to bring it here, because we've gone through that process of trying to deliver that scheme on site, and it hasn't been viable since the time when we've had the reserve matters approval and obtained costs for the works.
Thank you.
So forgive me, but you say it was never viable?
No, I say since we received the reserve matters approval in 2022, since that time, and then we went to the market and got market prices for the works. Since we received the market prices back, that scheme, it's always been in a difficult position in terms of viability.
Okay, Councillor Vincent.
Thank you. I was going to ask a similar question because I'm sure I heard you said it was never viable, but you've clarified what you've said.
Sorry, yeah, that was probably a bad wording on my behalf.
Okay. If I can ask you the question I asked the officer earlier, and we've heard that at 5 units, it certainly is not viable. From what we've seen at 2 units, considerably exceeds the viability test. Did nobody, or would you consider somewhere in between 5 and 2 affordable units? I'm just wondering, would 3 meet that viability test, and has anyone checked that?
The appraisals we've run and the viability demonstrates that it's only 2 units that achieve the viability where we need to be. But I think, as been mentioned before, we're kind of happy to look at, there's the clawback mechanism in there. So as we move forward, we're more than happy to consider that as we move forward. As I say, our appraisals demonstrate it's only 2 that works. If ultimately, I suppose the clawback provision would demonstrate that you could then gain, that allows for that provision for 3. If it turns out that it is viable based upon sales prices, but at the moment, 2 is just about works.
Yeah.
I don't know if the officer can help me with this. I'm finding it really disappointing that we have, as a council, a policy of affordable homes provision, and we are regularly hearing that that's not possible. And whilst we want to work with the developers to make that happen, this seems a site where potentially we could come up with a better outcome if that viability was tested, maybe for 3. I hear what's been saying, there's a mechanism to test check that. If we find as part of that build programme that it is possible to build 1 more, we're then reliant on that being delivered somewhere else. And how do we then get that delivered somewhere else is my question.
I think probably obviously, the different, there were a number of different scenarios, and CP did look at them, both by Savills and the separate quantity surveyors that the applicants have used. And I think those models were based on 5 units and 2 units. But what we didn't look at 3 purely because even on the 2 units, I think CP's advice to us was that, potentially it is just marginally viable as it is, and it's a very reasonable, good offer, and one that you should be probably grateful, obviously, to obviously try and achieve, the affordable housing that we are going to get out of the site. What they CP did also say was that essentially the build costs are obviously extremely high, which is reflective of across the whole development industry, but the house prices are very volatile still. And I think obviously they could only look at sales prices in the area that were based on sort of figures from essentially from the summer before, and obviously prices in terms of the housing market were a lot more buoyant than they are now. So I think with that in mind, CP's view was in the current climate in terms of the housing market, that even the offer of the 2 units is still a very good offer, and it's in the hope or anticipation that these will still sell at the sort of the typical values that are being said. I mean, if you look at the details that have been put in the report and the one that CP have advised, some of the values of the properties are, as I say, based on up to sort of 425,000, which in the area you would like to think is potentially possible given what CP have looked at in terms of the market conditions. But with certainly the recent months, their view is that it's still very, very uncertain. So I think their view was err on the side of caution with this, and 2 units is a good offer.
Can I just come back to you, Councillor Vincent, just in terms of on-site, off-site, because obviously that's that fundamental issue in terms of we have contributions, and then that we have to purchase land, and there's that delivery issue. And I obviously haven't been the case officer dealing with this application. We can commit to look at if there's an ability within the Section 106 to enable that conversation to happen at the point of the clawback, if there is any of that surplus, then as to whether that's is a contribution or whether there's enough surplus in terms of not further on-site delivery. On a number of schemes, there's practical issues around that for a developer being able to identify which properties. In this case, I think the designs aren't changing, so I think I'm happy to commit that we at least put a hook in the Section 106 clawback to enable that conversation to happen at that point in terms of that viability review.
Thank you. That's answered my question, and I'd really welcome that. Thank you.
Any further questions for the speakers, please? No, just a minute, Tony. Any further questions for the speakers? We're still on the speakers. Councillor Holland.
Yeah. Can I just ask then, given that the option there is to look at the potential for, rather than if there's a clawback system, that it may be that you could then provide 3, would you be prepared to undergo that conversation?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, no final questions for the speakers? No, if you'd like to resume your seats there, please. Thank you. Right,
I'll
so over
move
to
my
you, councillors.
recommendation for a third time, Chairman.
Okay. Okay, any further discussion on this? Councillor Vincent.
Just checking we're moving that recommendation with that amendment.
Yes.
Yes,
Thank you.
yes. Right, moved by
Me.
Councillor Adams, seconded by Councillor Folger. All those in favour, please. And against? 1. Okay, so that is carried. Thank you. Thank you. So we move now on to planning appeals, page 24. Did you have anything to say on that, Tracy?
Yeah, so it's just the one in terms of the refurb scheme. Just to draw to your attention, that has been dismissed, and they are on the grounds of lack of open space provision. I think we think that is a direct result of too many properties on the site and the neutrality in terms of harm to the protected sites. The inspector has had regard to the 5-year housing land supply position and still considered that application to be dismissed, obviously giving significant weight to housing. So I think that's just an interesting one in terms of the following our refusal. It's too many properties on the site.
Okay, any comment on that? Anybody? No? Okay, that closes the meeting then. Thank you very much.